From our studio in New Orleans, Louisiana, my name is Harmon. Welcome to Make It Fair, and happy Thanksgiving to you and yours. For many, it's one of the biggest meals of the year, and that's got us thinking about food in general. How much do you spend on food? How would you score the quality of your food? Do you even wonder about the quality of your food? It was just over 40 years ago, long before we suffered from an obesity epidemic, Americans spent a full third of their household budget on food. But now, other than the poorest fifth of households who spend an estimated 40% of their incomes feeding their families, Americans spend an average 6.4% of their paycheck on the food we eat, by far the lowest ratio in the world. I mean, it seems like a win, filling your plate while keeping more money in your pocket, but that short-term gain will be erased and then some by other looming costs associated with cheap food consumption. From healthcare to environmental impacts, we are on a path that will eventually be unsustainable. That's why we've invited food lawyer Pepper Bowen of the Culinaria Center for Food Law, Policy, and Culture to join us and talk supporting, developing, promoting substantial strategies via practical approaches to foster a food system that's beneficial to consumers, the environment, and food producers. Thank you for joining us, Pepper.
Thank you for having me.
So, educate us on what a food lawyer does.
Food law is a relatively new niche category of law.
Okay.
There are a couple of different areas where you can traverse food law. So one, and probably the most common or thoughtful place that people will recognize food as being a part of law would be USDA stamps.
Okay.
So on your grade A beef and even on your alcohol.
So regulations as far as what's passable, what's consumable by the public, this is your area.
Precisely. That is one area of food law. There's also consumer protections.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think of a few years back and Subway was sued for not actually selling a foot long.
It was like an inch off, right? 11 inches?
It was 11 inches. It was not a foot long. And so that is also an area of food law. And then there are areas that go into, say, business establishment, business entities, and business organizations, working with urban farmers in order to ensure that their contracts are in order, working with entrepreneurs in order to ensure that their value adds are actually making it to market, that they have whatever information that they need, up to and including trademarks and copyrights, not patents, because I'm not a patent attorney, and that is my area.
Okay, well, so here in New Orleans, I mean, you know, this is a worldwide problem and it's rampant in America, but here in New Orleans there seems to be some kind of a food gap for a lot of people.
There is.
I mean, we have an abundance of availability here. Why isn't it getting to the people?
Well, food access is a multifaceted issue that needs a multi-pronged answer. So even though you have people who might actually need food and are willing to purchase food, they may not have the security, the food security as in enough money in order to keep themselves fed on a regular basis and everyone within their household. And on the other end of that, we have farmers, whether they be commercial or urban farmers, being able to provide enough food for everyone to be able to purchase. So whether those urban farmers are producing, say, microgreens, think kale. So one of your greatest bestest superfoods that are coming out these days. Somebody who's food insecure, or somebody who is working at minimum wage, someone who has a family to support on that salary, may not venture into a high-priced item that they don't know.
That they're not familiar with, less likely to purchase.
Correct.
Regardless of the information about
Correct.
The superfood.
Right.
Factors.
Right. No, regardless of whatever nutritional value kale has over iceberg lettuce, because it is a known quantity, the purchase of iceberg lettuce is probably more reasonable and probably a sure bet. Then there's also the issue of the urban farmers who are at this point simply not able to provide the volumes of food that a large supplier, so think your major grocers in town, would require. And in that respect, they are already talking about working together in order to form a cooperative in order to supply. But as long as we don't put the value on urban farming that we should, then we won't get there as a community.
Well, why don't we then?
Because interestingly enough,
sounds like a reasonable thing. You know?
It does. But interestingly enough, we not only fantasize about what farming used to be, and so that way we romanticize what a farmer is.
Okay.
But we also demonize the farmer for not producing pretty fruit and vegetables, and we complain about the prices even if there's been some sort of a weather event that has precluded the actual production of the fruit or vegetables, the produce itself. So although yes, it does make sense that we would move to an area where, or to a space and time where we are allowing and supporting urban farmers to do just what they want to do, which is to grow food for the people. We have competing priorities in that respect, and we don't put the proper value on urban farming and general farming, not as opposed to commercial farming, as we should.
Well, so we don't put proper value on it. What's the motivation behind that? I mean, you're telling me here there's a proper value, there's something that we should absolutely consider, but why wouldn't we then? You know, what's the reasoning behind that?
Subsidies, generally.
Okay.
So commercial farming is highly subsidized in a number of different ways, and when we think of big agriculture, a couple of high incentives or large incentives do spring to mind. Those would be corn and sugar. So
Mass produce it, not necessarily great nutritional value, but can provide a whole lot of items at a cheap price.
Right, or at least a foundation for those items, right? So some time back we moved from a biodiverse growing arena into a monoculture. So we continue to plant the same things in the same ground year after year, and we attempt to remediate the land by pumping some sorts of chemicals into the soil in order to bring it back to life. But generally speaking, what we're doing is depleting the ground itself as well as depleting nutritional value from the actual food.
Sounds like something that would change the molecular structure over time, which then would change the ultimate growing product.
Agreed.
Okay, well, so what are you doing here in New Orleans to try to bridge some of these gaps?
So working with the Food Policy Advisory Committee, what we are doing is identifying and and just completed the first round of a food assessment. That food assessment not only identifies where we have food as a system, so where you're buying it, where people are selling it, where people are wanting to eat it, including restaurants, but also identifying food producers. Where are they? How can they get into the food system? If they can get in, if there are any barriers to entry, what are they and how can those be addressed, whether those are through law or through policy? And once we have all of those bits and pieces identified, then we can move in different areas more strategically in order to assist those folks, whether it be from a legal policy perspective or from a business perspective. So if it is that as a value add producer who makes jams on Saturday mornings to sell at a farmer's market, you need a microloan in order to buy jars, then knowing exactly where to place that person through some sort of a business or institution that would assist and support those types of food entrepreneurs here in town. Or if we're looking at someone who wants to compost, what department in City Hall would they need to speak in order to ensure that they've got the proper zoning and that they've got the proper permits?
Well, okay, so we've identified that there are some of these issues, and you mentioned subsidies and agriculture being a big business. I mean, wouldn't it make sense to maybe start to point some of these subsidies towards places where you can get affordable food to people without it destroying their business model? It seems like if you can give people the option and they can buy it, what's wrong with that then?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it. There's simply not an incentive for big ag in order to adjust their subsidies to provide food for the local market. And I don't say that as an edict or an indictment on big agriculture. What I'm saying is that they are a business, and despite the type of business that they are, so when you think of agriculture, you think of food, and the point of having food would be to feed people, if not animals, but to feed someone. But as a business, their bottom line is the bottom line. So they are looking at simply making money. The idea of shifting those subsidies is a very altruistic goal, and I am in full support.
Well, sure, but I mean, it just seems like if they could look to the future instead of staying stuck in a model that is becoming outdated.
True.
Won't they continue to survive? Won't they sustain themselves?
They could if they would shift their way of growing. So as opposed to growing millions of dollars worth of corn that is then used for corn syrup that becomes sodas, or the basis of a lot of things that sit on the shelves, or feed that goes to animals that were never intended to eat corn, including fish, or
Right.
even a substitute for a lot of different products that we should be able to grow still. So fillers, think of corn as a filler in that respect, not necessarily a corn bread, but bread that has had corn filled into it in order to make it more substantial. There are a lot of value streams for big agriculture and big corn in that respect. And to remove half of, say, or even a quarter of what it is that they currently grow in order to grow things, and then conversely grow things that would be just for consumption for whatever the local area, it doesn't have an immediate impact, which is what business is intended to do, is to make money immediately.
Right.
Yes, it is. There are amazing long-term implications where folks not only could get food, they could keep enough food to eat. You would actually provide the foundation. And so instead of being hungry and focusing on just being hungry, whether it's a child throughout the day or the millions of folks who are adults who work all of the time and still can't afford to feed themselves, it seems like the right thing to do. But there is a resistance, and whether you call it commercialism, you call it business, or you call it capitalism, we as a society have not found that is the move that we need to take. So as we move towards alternative energy sources, so instead of utilizing big corn to create methanol and as opposed to gasoline, when we move away from your traditional coal in order to provide electricity, and we move into more green energy sources like solar and wind or water or what have you, yes, I think that logically that step will be made in concert with those other more forward-thinking ideals. But at this point, we are, for whatever reason, holding on to the past.
Well, you know, to that point, I mean, yes, there's a lot of pushback against energy production in the form of solar and wind, even though we have enough evidence to know that they provide an abundance of clean energy. But it is clear that we are moving in that direction, and that progress is not going to stop. It feels like the move towards making our food supply healthier and making access, giving more availability to people, that seems to be lagging behind. Am I getting that correctly?
So the issue with food access is that most folks think of it as more of a charity model, right? So we think food access in concert with food deserts. So food deserts are traditionally thought of as low socioeconomic environments where you can find a corner store, you can get alcohol, cigarettes, and say packaged
bare basic grocery necessities, but fresh food is not available.
Exactly. But what we don't ever stop to think about is that in newly gentrified areas, or in areas where there's not a grocery store or a farmer's market specifically, that you can find a wine cellar, a cheesemonger, a fresh bread baker, a boulangerie, as it were. But what you won't find is still fresh fruit and vegetables. So when we think of food deserts and we think of food access, if the access to food is fresh food, then that model exists in both low as well as moderate to upper income areas. There have been some who've argued that the definition of food desert should instead include restaurants. But whether you can actually afford to eat at a restaurant every day,
I mean, the
should
markup,
certainly
running a restaurant, you know, it's not like there's no cost there. It's a business, but
exactly.
One of the smallest costs for a restaurant is food. That the actual food they serve is one of their smaller costs, but the price point tends to be quite hiked up.
Depending upon the restaurant and its reviews, absolutely.
And certainly, there's nothing wrong with trying to charge for the experience of the restaurant.
Sure.
But the accessibility, it seems like to include them, to say, all right, if you have enough restaurants available to you, then you're not in a food desert. Doesn't seem like it's really talking to people who have little money, that are already stretched.
Well, yeah, when we start talking about restaurants as a way for people to have access to food, we're talking prepared foods. But even if we're talking some of the other models, so say a farmer's market or a grocery store, in areas where folks have already changed their buying habits, or they've already got their plan for the day, then they're not going to change their buying habits until there's a reason to do so. So we've had a number of different soft starts. Circle Foods, for instance, got a fresh food retailer initiative grant a couple years back, post-Katrina, where they were getting in more fresh fruits and vegetables. Since then, they've had a number of environmental issues with flooding in that area.
Right.
So no matter what you think of it, the bottom line is that they are one of very few grocery stores that provides some sort of access to upper 9 as well as lower 9 and part of Treme. If you go far enough in, you'll actually find the Canseco's that's on Esplanade, and then farther up there's the Whole Foods on Broad, which is actually doing a really good job of assuming the role of fresh food and organic and things of that nature, as well as they've even got a farmer's market that rolls over there on Mondays.
Yep.
And farther up from there on Broad Street is the Ideal, but the Circle Foods from there at the corner of St. Bernard and Claiborne, 5 miles down to the Walmart in Chalmette, there's not another grocery store. And you'll find that in those areas, that even though there was a great change in the demographics, when we were Hollywood South, a lot of those folks were renters and they've now left.
Right.
You don't see that there are a whole lot of folks who owned before the storm who are still there. Even the folks who were in Treme have since moved out to Gentile for a number of reasons. Some is because they were renters, even though they'd been in the house for generations, they just hadn't bought it. Others was because there was far too much damage to whatever their house was, and then it was easier and cheaper to move. But anyways, back to food.
Sidebar.
Yes. When we start talking about making food available, it's only got to be available, it's also got to be at a price point that people can afford. So I think of a couple of areas in town where they do offer great products. Don't get me wrong, as in fresh pulled out of the ground this morning, but if you're selling a fresh pulled out of the ground green pepper for $3 or $4 a piece, that makes it cost prohibitive for all but a very small section of the population. And this is not just about the folks who can afford to spend $3 to $4. This is about the folks who are willing to pay $3 to $4 for a pepper, recognizing that there are other responsibilities afoot. So I can understand that it is best for my health long term to eat fresh and to eat local and to do what's right for the environment by not adding up those food miles, by shipping things in. But I also recognize that I've got rent to pay at the end of this month, and I've got kids who are in schools, and I have other responsibilities.
You got to prioritize.
We've got to juggle. We've got to prioritize.
But what about eating habits? I mean, if we make the better food more available, I mean, what do you say to someone who says, "Oh, these people are never going to buy it"?
Well, I think that we as a collective have tried a couple of different ways in order to approach that. The first is that I can think of off the top of my head would be the fresh food corner stores. So there have been a couple of corner stores, not the least of which was Danny's Grocery at Calliope and Simon Bolivar that opened not too long ago as a fresh food corner store where you can go in and you can buy a small selection, but it is a selection of fresh food. But what I will say that as a cultural, or a nod to the cultural issues, is that folks who have been eating the way they've been eating for 30 or 40 years, the chances of them changing those habits are simply not great. Additionally, you'll find that they have gastrointestinal issues if you quickly shift your diet to something else. And so reasonably, if you're changing someone's eating habits, which are incredibly personal to each one of us for a number of reasons, starting with the next generation is probably the easiest way to do that. So educating kids who are still in high school, kids who haven't gotten out on their own yet and are using their own money as buying power in order to make choices of what's on the shelves, and teaching them what the values are and how it is that they can eat healthy and not spend a fortune.
Do you think we're making inroads in that, as far as that's concerned, trying to reach younger people and change the overwhelming thought?
I think in ways we are. I think that there were a number of farms that were popping up around town, and not only farms for like Sugar Roots Farm, for instance, on the West Bank, has a petting zoo where you can go and find out more. Grodat has an internship program where you can go and learn how to be a farmer. But there are also small schools that actually had raised beds where kids could go and they would learn how things grow and how they move. And that was a larger movement that came out of Southern California some years ago. I think that as we continue to deprioritize eating habits, and that then means that we deprioritize health and we deprioritize our economy, that we are continuing to make the same mistakes and continuing to look at the old tried and true resources in order to fix those mistakes once they're made. So it becomes more reactive as opposed to proactive. Although there are a number of kids who are identifying foods that they may not have known how to do, say 5 or 10 years ago, there is not enough in order to make the dent in childhood obesity that we need to. And there's certainly not enough in order to combat the food-related diseases that develop over time.
Oh, well, I mean, it just seems to me that even though there's not a great desire on the part of big business and big agriculture to go there, it would seem that ultimately it would be in their best benefit. Healthier populace can do more.
Agreed.
Will live longer. They will buy more products.
Yes.
So,
and that's all a grocery store wants, right? We want you to live so you can come back and buy more stuff next week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect business model right there. How hard of a job is it, though, to move the needle on this? I mean, what kind of struggles are you facing personally in your attempts to move us forward here?
Wow. So personally, I'm working with a number of different organizations in order to try to push the needle in a number of different ways. But what springs to mind is coastal protection. And what I mean by that is that we have not only the erosion of the coastline, but we also have invasive species both in the water and on the ground that are assisting with that erosion. Right. So think Asian carp, right? So there's been a lot of bad press around Asian carp. Most people have equated Asian carp to a bottom feeder. And the only thing that people are really sure of is that the Asian carp is the jumping fish, right? So they are the ones that have been known to spring out of the water when they're afraid. Usually you see them jumping in large numbers around alligator spawning seasons, but they are an incredibly adaptive fish. They are voracious eaters. They grow to 115 or so pounds. And that means that one fish can feed a family of 6. If you do it right. Now the problem is that Asian carps, because they need to propel themselves out of the water, have a rib cage that's curved inwards, and that means that you cannot easily fillet it as you would, say, a snapper. Okay. That it needs to be done in either 4 parts, or you need to steam it in order to get the pin bones out, and then culturally, we as Americans don't like pulling bones out of our
extra
fish.
Layers of preparation.
Yeah, we're just not doing
thing.
it. Precisely. And restaurants also find that it's time consuming in order to have someone standing there picking bones out of the fish, and it destroys then the fillet itself. And so what do you do with it? They're losing money. So business model is speed and efficiency, not necessarily what's best for all of us. Conversely, we've got feral hogs. So feral hogs are cousins to farmed pigs, and they are doing millions of dollars worth of damage every year to not only our coastlines and our levee systems, but they're also digging up actual commercial crops, as opposed to figuring out some sort of a way to get the feral hog on the plate. We are doubling down on food safety. Now, the legal aspect of it is that, yes, we do have FDA regulations that are in place in order to keep us all safe, right? So we don't necessarily want to eat something that's riddled with germs and disease and things like that. Think Upton Sinclair's book from years and years ago that actually spawned all of this confusion, The Jungle. And so the idea is that we want to ensure that the food is safe to consume. But what we have done in the process of making sure that the food is safe to consume is to create an entire industry that also has other industries that it supports underneath itself to ensure that everything goes and is funneled through this particular door.
Right. So other options are not being considered.
Right. So in the state of Louisiana, we have 19 slaughterhouses, and there's only one of them that actually goes through the trouble and the expense of bringing in an FDA certified inspector.
Okay.
And so that one slaughterhouse not only can sell direct to grocery stores, but they can sell direct to the client, to the customer. And that's great. But they have to do so at a cost of an extra $5 per pound in order to make sure that they are covering their own costs. So if there were a change in not only the mindset of what it means to eat pork, right? So we continually have this idea that all food should come from farms. And we have neglected the idea that at one point we didn't have farmed pigs necessarily. They sort of roamed free. But that there were bison here when we got them, that even for a time when trappers were all new, that in Louisiana people were eating nutria and it wasn't so much of a problem. That's another conversation. However, moving folks away from this idea that the farm is safe into eating wild may be better for you is a tough climb. Not a climb that we're not taking or we're not doing. It's just people have a
climb, though.
Right. People have a tendency to forget that all those diseases that or the pink slime that came out and the mad cow that all those came off of farms. And these were just practices that should not have been done. Agreed. And as a general testament, this is not something that happens on a regular basis. But when we also start thinking about the beakless chickens who are held in little tiny containers, or we're thinking about the pigs that are shot up with so many antibiotics that now that's impacting our health, that that we've got these super germs and super flus
and so we're not dogging farming here, but what we're saying is that maybe in an attempt to say, okay, we're going to cut all these other options out because we're looking at food safety. Now we need to look at even stronger regulations because some of it has gone awry. They're like, oh well, this isn't part of what we have to do, so let's just add this to the mix, or is this kind of what you're saying? To
an extent, I honestly believe that they can live in concert, right? So if we had farmers who were willing to slaughter wild boar and could sell it legally, as opposed to having to go through these extra hoops and such, then I think that can not only bolster the pig farming here that's third in the economy behind poultry and seafood, that we could also assist with the removal or control, I won't say eradication, but the control of feral swine, right? So it's a win-win in many ways. It's a lot more dangerous to capture a wild boar and transport it for inspection than it is just to kill it and sell it, which is interesting that you can't sell it, but what you can do is to put it on a spit and give it to your family and friends.
What about, there should be some sort of consideration maybe given to environmental impact. Some of the way we're producing foods and some of the companies that are now part of the food sources are having some pretty significant impacts on our overall environment.
Agreed.
And that's going to be quite costly in the long run, isn't it?
It long run, short run, all the runs, yes. So what springs to mind when we start talking big ag and big businesses that are doing a disservice to the local areas would be Cancer Alley, and we think of all of the manufacturing pollution that goes into the water and how all of those poor folks ended up, and I don't mean economically poor, I mean it's as far as like sorrow is concerned. Yes, it's a sad state of affairs that they have ended up with lots of respiratory issues, as well as actual different forms of cancer in those areas. But it's not just our Cancer Alley; it's a lot of different places. So
Sure.
when we start thinking about whatever the manufacturer is and how they are actually getting rid of their runoffs. Right, so whether it be that you are doing something that's not food related at all, say you are mining for gold. There are chemicals that are used in order to mine for gold, and if they're going into, and in this particular instance, the Amazon River, then you're killing whatever is in that water. If you are in, say, the Middle East or even farther east into India, and we are doing a lot of commercial farming, and you're dumping a lot of chemicals into the ground in order to ensure that the fertilizers and that was fertilizer.
Yes, I understood.
Yes,
I knew exactly what that
the
meant.
growing things, the runoffs from the fertilizers, the pesticides, in order to keep the insects from actually eating away whatever the crops that there actually are, happens here as well. That will eventually make its way into a water source. The water sources themselves now are under fire. Insofar as regulations are concerned, because there are a number of protections, 52 by last count, that the current administration is removing in order to protect not only the water but also the ground itself, so that there would not be necessarily any recourse for folks to ensure that their water is safe.
But so basically, we're at a pressing point here where we're able to move forward, and we've tried to, but now a lot of these new rules and regulations are being pulled back in favor of saving big business money.
Correct. And that's just here though, right? So we didn't have, or big business didn't have the same regulations or the same restrictions abroad. And I'm thinking of places where there was big business and there were the big companies that were coming from America and were actually drilling into their fresh water sources, removing the fresh water supply from there in order to bottle here. So when you pick up your bottle of water, it has to come from somewhere. You don't just manufacture water.
Water doesn't appear out of thin air.
Correctly, yes. So the correctly said, whether it be for a bottle of water or even a soda, or if it is a prepackaged tea, anything that starts with a liquid started with water in some level. And all of these companies are getting the water from someplace. Again, they didn't have the same restrictions that we had here that forced those companies in order to make sure that the runoffs weren't going into the remaining streams, that they weren't contaminating or polluting the existing earth. But they found a more, how should I say, fertile ground in the countries abroad. Now that we are lifting the regulations here, they don't have to go so far.
I see, but ultimately it sounds again like a short game, short-term gains that will ultimately turn into no more gains if we keep going in this direction. Does that sound about right?
It is indeed, yes, it is about right. There are a lot of things that we do that are a little upside down, right? So a few years back, this springs to mind, a few years back everyone was rushing out and buying little pills of fish oil because fish oil was going to be so great for you.
Right.
But no one stopped to think that the fish oil has to come from an actual fish that's pulverized into oil. Yeah, so
You're kidding me.
an actual fish, who would have thunk it? So menhaden is that actual fish, and they are not the most attractive little fish, but we had tons of them in the Gulf of Mexico, and now we're just overfishing them. So it's not so much that we're taking the fish out of the water, it's that it's a feeder fish. So if you take that fish out of the water, what are the larger fish eating?
Right.
And we have a tendency to do that in a lot of different ways.
We don't think about effects on the ecosystem.
Exactly. And that's really the ultimate issue, is that the ecosystem, as we have evolved to this space, is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not a long-term solution. We are not going to continue to be able to overproduce and waste as much food as we do. We are not going to continue to be able to pollute the waters and still have water to drink. The manufacturing off gases continue to pollute the air, will continue to create other health problems, not only now but in the future. And so until we actually get a handle on those things and then start to rethink and understand that there will be a short-term loss for a long-term gain, then we're going to end up right back where we started from.
All right, well, in closing, is there anything you would like to set for us for goals for your agency and for all of us?
Goals for all of us. I would love to see people stop drinking bottled water. That would be amazing to me for a number of reasons. One, the plastic, and two, the fact that, again, the water is being taken out of someone else's groundwater. Then I'm certainly not saying that I have full faith and confidence in the Sewage and Water Board of New Orleans, but what I am saying is that with enough filters, we can make anything work. And for my agency, as we are working for Culinaria, we are working towards doing, again, working on feral hogs, trying to figure out how it is that we can increase the understanding that Asian carp as well as feral hogs can be brought to the table, and once you remove them from the ecosystem, then it's no longer an invasive species. So again, it's back to understanding the culture.
All right, well, thank you very much. Pepper Bowen, a food lawyer and director of Culinaria, Center for Food Law, Policy, and Culture here in New Orleans. Keep up the great work. We really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for watching. It's Harmon Dash from Make It Fair. We'll talk to you next time.